welcome back to the Warsaw Security Forum here in the Polish capital, one of the biggest events of the kind in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska, and you're watching TVP World. And now it is the time for another guest of mine, James Rogers from the Council on Geostrategy, the co-founder and the director of research. Thank you so much for joining me. I know that the last time we spoke, we were in a slightly different environment. We were in London talking about defense and security, especially in relation to the ongoing war in Ukraine. So thank you once again for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I was looking at the report that was published by the Council on Geostrategy, and I would like to take a slightly different avenue now, because I would like to focus on the United Kingdom and the sort of a relationship that it might in the future try and forge in relation to the ongoing war in Ukraine and defense as well as security. In one of your briefings I read, there has never been a more important time to consider the UK's defense alliances and partnerships. As of now, how would you describe these relationships when it comes to the change in the government that took place in July of this year, and a slightly more open approach towards the European Union in general, but also the ongoing war in Ukraine and the UK's support?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So over the last few years, the UK, I think, has tried to diversify its portfolio of alliances and strategic partnerships. So traditionally, there had been a very strong focus on NATO allies and other countries in the North Atlantic area. That hasn't gone away, but the previous government, I think, tried to diversify those relationships by building closer alignments with countries such as Australia through the AUKUS arrangements, also with Japan, but there was also an approach to try and diversify Britain's relationships within Europe itself, so a stronger focus on countries such as Poland, the Baltic states, the Nordic states, and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe as well. I think the new government is actually going to continue along a very similar line. So yes, it is putting greater emphasis on reconnecting Britain with traditional allies such as France and Germany, and beyond that, of course, the European Union. But on the other hand, it's also continuing to support this diversification effort with countries such as Poland, Sweden, Finland, and as well as countries further afield in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Australia and Japan. These were the first countries that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, reached out to after becoming the leader of the UK in terms of the political system, and also the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary have sought to reach out to over the last few months as well.
So you mentioned a diversification of those relationships with, for example, Poland. What would that entail?
So the UK has tried to develop a much deeper relationship with Poland. Poland has become increasingly important, both in an EU context, but also a NATO context, particularly as its defence modernisation programme has accelerated. Its strategic location on the eastern flank, or even the eastern front of the alliance, its connections to Ukraine and the broader region. So the UK has sought to become more involved there to support its Polish ally. This has taken the form of the enhanced forward presence through NATO, the deployment of British forces, which helps to extend the British nuclear deterrent over the most exposed NATO allies, but also countries adjacent to Poland, like those in the Baltic states as well. So there's been a broadening and deepening of the relationships across this entire region, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, of course, then systematized, if you will, with Ukraine, where the UK has played quite a strong, even disproportionate role in providing military assistance, armaments, and financial support.
Do you think that those new relationships that the UK is trying to forge is somewhat a thing that happened simply because of the situation and the war in Ukraine, or is it something that also has political implications, as in, for example, Prime Minister Keir Starmer trying to get closer to its European allies after Brexit?
I think it's all connected. I think it would have happened irrespective of Brexit. I mean, the strategic changes that have taken place across Europe and the wider world since Brexit, which now is some time ago, have accelerated. So we see the resurgence of Russian power in the region. That probably would have occurred with or without Brexit. We see the rise of China as a global power with influenced geoeconomic and geopolitical growing also in Europe and further afield. So I think this was almost inevitable given the strategic circumstances, but of course Brexit compounds that effect, and the UK seeks and has always sought to have a very close relationship with its European partners and allies, and I suppose in that context it makes as much sense.
I was after receiving your report last night, I was going through what allies want appraising Britain's defense relationship. So that's the name of the report. And as we read further, extending the nuclear deterrent over others, sharing the experience of the British Armed Forces, supporting the development of military technology, and spending more on foreign defense equipment. When you're outlining those elements, are there any possible challenges that you could see in UK actually forging those relationships with Europe?
I mean, there are a number of challenges, but on the big strategic issues, I think the UK is on the same page as its most important European allies, of which I consider Poland to be one of them. So that study that you mentioned, it's based on an opinion survey of British political and economic elites to ask them which allies and partners they think will be Britain's most important, both today, but also from the vantage point of 2030. And it's interesting to see that Poland is fifth overall today, and it will remain fifth by 2030. Most allies remain within the same place. Australia becomes a little more important, given, I suppose, the importance of AUKUS to the UK as well as to the broader international environment. But I think the UK will continue to develop those relationships, and I think in particular with Poland it will become increasingly important because of the shared alignment, particularly on Russia and the threat that Russia poses to the Euro-Atlantic order, which of course the UK as a nuclear power and a nuclear custodian of the NATO alliance is one of the leading actors.
In terms of defense and security, what would you say is the outlook of experts, for example, in the United Kingdom when it comes to the steps that the European Union is taking in order to secure its eastern flank, as well as supporting the Baltic states and supporting Poland as the eastern flank of Europe?
So I think most British strategic experts and British government officials would say that whatever the European Union does to complement the actions taken by NATO would be beneficial to European security. And as long as there isn't duplication of efforts, which would of course cost additional money which many European countries either do not want to find or do not have, then it would be to the advantage of both. So it's about finding a kind of mutually inclusive way that the two organizations, or the Defence Alliance of NATO and the European Union, can support one another, and the UK is prepared to play its part in supporting both of those.
Obviously, the change in government in July this year brought many questions about how the UK is dealing with its military, if it's ready, especially after the Iranian attack on Israel. Some senior members of the UK military spoke out and said, in case such an attack drone attack, for example, would take place over our land, we would not be able to protect London to such an extent, as well as some of the nuclear plants. Where do you think the UK stands in protecting itself? Because we know it's been very clear since the very start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that the UK is actually one of the greatest supporters of Ukraine since day one. But what in case of UK itself and state defense? So
those arguments and those claims, they do deserve some credibility. I mean, yes, there are concerns, and yes, over many, many years, even decades, the UK has reduced its defence spending as a percentage of GDP. Recently, it's been trying to increase it, and the current government, as the previous government, have both pledged that they will increase it to 2.5% of GDP in the near term. And the current strategic defence review that the government has undertaken is being based on the assumption that defence spending will rise. And even though it's only a small rise from the current spending levels, it will be quite a significant amount of money because of the size of the UK's GDP. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that the UK is a nuclear power. So despite the fact that these are legitimate arguments to be made or to be had, nonetheless, I think it would be quite a challenge for a country to attack the UK using a massive coordinated drone strike or something of that size and not expect
Obviously, it's a speculation, but it's something to definitely pay attention to, because once these things are happening on the continent, it makes you rethink certain scenarios that have taken place in the past.
Yes. But nonetheless, the UK is a major military power armed with a nuclear deterrent. I think any country, particularly one like Russia, would have to think very, very seriously of the consequences should it seek to copy such an attack.
I wanted to look at the financial side of things because we know that the UK government is trying to change things around. They're trying to find money where there might be less. And there is a certain financial strain when it comes to, for example, the recent winter, the vote for the winter fuel cut, which sparked a lot of controversy in the United Kingdom and a lot of discussion. And yet we had the UK pledge an incredibly significant amount of money, £3 billion until 2030, 2031, or as we heard from Prime Minister Keir Starmer, for as long as it takes. So do you think, considering the current financial situation, this is something that the UK can afford?
Yes, in short. I mean, the £3 billion pledge is a significant amount of money, but in relation to the UK's economic output, it's a relatively small amount. It's significantly less than 1% of GDP. In fact, I think it's even less than 0.5% of GDP. So it's a very small amount of money. Now, given the threat that Russia poses to the UK, and explicitly, I would say, to the UK. Remember the Salisbury poisonings of a few years ago, and then there were other poisonings that occurred previous, around a decade before that. So Russia has struck the UK using kind of asymmetric or non-linear means. So I think that threat will continue. Now, if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, and that cannot be ruled out, the threat will become significantly greater, and it will cost significantly more for the UK to try and put that right, both in terms of deterring threats to its NATO allies, but also in constraining Russian ambitions, which may be emboldened by the fact that Russia may eventually win in some form in Ukraine. So the short-term cost of increasing defense spending or supporting Ukraine will be significantly less than the long-term risk or challenge of containing a much more emboldened and aggressive Russia. And that is a fundamental thing that the UK, as well as other European countries, need to confront.
I wanted to approach the subject of Ukraine and UK's support for Ukraine from a slightly different angle, the angle of the US presidential election taking place already next month. How time flies. And I was wondering, what are the voices in the UK? If, for example, Donald Trump would be to win, is there any concern as to the future of support for Ukraine? There were also voices a few months ago during the presidential campaign that if Donald Trump would be to follow his claims in terms of NATO, it would be the UK, the United Kingdom, that could actually take the lead, especially when it comes to support for Ukraine. What's your opinion on that?
So, I mean, it depends on the eventualities of the situation, or what we end up with in a few months from now. It's difficult to say. The UK considers NATO to be completely and utterly central to its entire defence posture, its entire defence system. So it would be difficult to see how NATO would function without the sheer might of the United States behind it. But at the same time, given the centrality of NATO to the UK would have to step up if an American president, whether it's Donald Trump or some future president, or because of some kind of political eventuality in the United States. Remember, a few months ago, there was also some concern that Congress would hold up funding towards
definitely.
Towards
that
Ukraine.
was a big topic of discussion as well.
So in those circumstances, it may be necessary for the UK to significantly step up. But of course, the cost of doing that would be greater than if we can convince our American friends, in whatever form they might take, to provide that assistance. I wouldn't rule out that that Donald Trump, should he be elected, would take the line that we might have seen in recent months and years him taking. I think the system will have an impediment on him. But nonetheless, over the longer term, I think it's fair to say that the Americans will become increasingly concerned with the rise of China and what that means for their global defense posture. And that Europeans, the UK, Poland, will have to really pick up to provide the kind of backfilling for the US as they seek to broaden their strategic horizons.
Thank you so much, James. A pleasure as always to have you, whether it be in London or here in Warsaw in our studios. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, this was James Rogers, the co-founder and the director of research at the Council on Geostrategy from London. My name is Klaudia Czerwińska, and please stay tuned here on TVP World for more.